Good morning, guys. My name is Ms. Dupree, and I am your reading teacher for the week. We are on Unit 4, Week 5, Jobs in My Community. This is day 1. So we have been learning and becoming experts about different jobs that we're studying. Today, we are going to move on to research question number 4. So we're almost through all of our research questions. Real quick before we get into our research question, there's a few new terms that you're going to need to be familiar with this week in order to complete your writing and doing your research. So this is our glossary. Some of these we've already seen: purpose, responsibility, speciality, community. We're already familiar with those. The 3 new ones are the different types of communities. So the first one I have listed is called a rural community. This is a place where there's a small number of people spread over a large area of land. This is often called living in the country. Then we have urban communities. So this is kind of the total opposite of rural. We have large numbers of people living very close together. These are called cities. And then we have a suburban community. It kind of falls in between urban and rural. These are areas that kind of grow right outside of cities. Let's look at what our research question is for this week. So number 4 says, how is this job different in different places? So we're going to be thinking about how our job changes between a rural community, a suburban community, or an urban community. So we're going to be looking at what changes and what we might need to use in our job depending on what kind of community we live in. So you guys should have already listened to our read aloud for today, which is a field guide to your community geography. So here's a few things I would like us to think about before we get started. It says, what is the author saying about research question number 4? How do we know? And why does it matter to our studies of jobs? So real quick, if I take you to the read aloud that we worked on, you can also find this on the ARC bookshelf in case you want to go back and refer to it. We're going to look back at it and see what this has to do with our research question for this week. So they're giving us some definitions of the rural, urban, and suburban areas. And then it's going in and it's talking about each of them. So it's talking about the benefits to living in a rural community, the challenges to living in the rural community, and then it's kind of giving you some of the top jobs in rural communities. And it's easy, we can kind of infer some of these challenges and these benefits to our own jobs. So it says, like when it says challenges, our country is having trouble making sure that there are enough good jobs available in rural communities. This means many young people worry they might have to leave home to find a good job. There are rural communities that maybe don't have access to doctors or hospitals because of how far they are. Maybe they have to drive an hour away to get there. So this would affect jobs like nurses and doctors, right? And it might look different. Same with, they're obviously still going to have emergency personnel like firefighters and an ambulance, but they're probably not going to have as many as we would have in a city. And then we can look at the urban communities and the suburban communities. So they talk about the challenges and benefits of each one. So you're going to kind of have to go through and you're going to need to look at each of these and think about what your job looks like in each of these communities. So the benefits in an urban community is there's lots of people. So if you're a nurse, a doctor, a teacher, a police officer, any of those things, you will be very busy. There are lots of people that need an education. There's lots of people that are going to need to be taken care of. So they're going to need lots of nurses, lots of doctors, right? And often urban communities, because there's more people that live there, they have more money. And more money allows them to be able to have more technology and allow for better access to things across all different jobs. And the suburban community, like I said earlier, it kind of falls in between the two different areas. So it says that there are a lot of jobs and more people live in the suburbs than people live in cities and rural areas combined. But the cost of the houses and apartments is getting higher and higher in the suburban communities because a lot of people prefer to kind of live in between. So maybe they're not packed in to the city, but they can live in the suburban areas and it won't be quite as crowded, but it also offers them still being close to hospitals and stuff like that. So when I look through this, I could use this book to even help me with my research question, because I know if I'm studying teachers, I can see in urban communities top job categories. Number 4 is education. Number 3 in the suburban community is also education. What if you're studying nurses or doctors? Number 1 is healthcare in urban communities. Number 2 is healthcare in suburban communities. If we look back to our rural area, number 2 is education, but number 1 is agriculture. So when we think of agriculture, we're going to think of farmers. So maybe you're studying a farmer. This would be an area where they would really be able to thrive, because that is what they would do, is agriculture, raising animals, crops, whereas in cities, they're not going to have that ability because there's not as much land, right? And then we noticed that healthcare is not really listed on this rural one, because a lot of the hospitals are in bigger cities, so they have to drive a little bit farther away. They don't necessarily have a hospital in their rural community. So I think if we think about what the author is trying to say about this research question, is they're showing you why these jobs change depending on what community your job is located. So just like I said with education, if I'm living in a rural community, there's not going to be as many students for me to teach. There's not going to be very much access to technology. There's not a lot of money to have access to do extra things with your students. But if you're living in an urban community, you have lots of access to lots of students, lots of technology. There's more money, so there can be more programs to help the students and for you to be able to use with them. Same thing with the nurses and doctors. So it's showing you the differences. Now, that's the difference between the rural and urban communities, and it kind of falls in the urban communities' favor in those. But if we looked at agriculture, we saw that it was more of a rural community job. So you would be able to compare those two things. That, and how does it matter to our study of jobs? Because your job is going to depend on where you're living and what kind of resources you have. So I kind of put some examples for our research question number 4. This is what your FPO is going to look like. I used all different jobs because I didn't want to just use one certain job for you guys, because this week it's going to require you to do a lot of reading and inferring. So let's look at the urban communities. My examples are construction workers make more money in bigger cities. So those are their working conditions, okay? They have more access to money, which allows people to be building more things, whereas in rural communities, they're not building as much, right? And then for equipment, transportation, and other technology, I put some jobs may have access to more technology because of being in a big city. So that would be the education, healthcare, police officers, firefighters, all those different things will have more access to technology due to being in a bigger city. Now, if we look at the suburban community, we could think about being a teacher. There's more women than there are men for teachers. And it says groups of people who do this job. Typically, you have more females than males as teachers. Now, we do have some men that are teachers, but there tend to be more women. Working conditions. Some jobs may have different rules because of neighborhoods. So depending on where you're teaching or what kind of community you're based in, your job and your roles and the rules might change a little bit. And then if we look at rural communities, there may not be a lot of certain jobs. So because a rural community doesn't have as much going on, there's not going to be as many opportunities for them. For example, like with equipment, transportation, and other technology, if we think about firefighters, in a rural community, they're going to need off-road fire trucks for fires where there are no roads. Whereas in cities, they're not going to have that problem. So they're going to require different transport and equipment because of where they are located in a rural community. If we think about preparation, education, or training, let's think about vets may need additional education about different animals that live in a rural community. So when we think of vets, we think of maybe taking our dog, our cat, maybe you have a pet lizard or something you might take to the vet. But in a rural community, you're going to be thinking of a lot of agricultural jobs. So let's think pigs, horses, cows. So these vets might need additional education on how to care for these different farm animals. All right, so if we look, this is your FPO that you're going to be working on today. It's the same thing as what I just showed you guys. I just kind of made it colored so it would stand out a little bit more for you. So you're going to be looking to see what you can fill in about your job depending on all these different communities. Just like I didn't have every box filled out up here, you may not have every box filled out. That's okay. All right, here's some wow facts I wanted to include because we're keeping up with all that. It says jobs change depending on climate and natural resources. It's harder to find jobs in rural areas. Builders change how they build based on climate zones. So I thought those were some interesting things from today's reading about community geography. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow for day 2.